not the most eloquent ones, but and that's because I'm not a literary, I don't approach it from the literature angle, but from the history angle. So I'm generally interested in what a particular piece of poetry, a piece of genre of poetry, or even a particular verse says about a particular period of history, about the people who were there, what was going on in the city. So for this particular evening, I decided that I will really focus on one ghazal, and but I will talk about the background, the historical background of that, because as I said, my interest is the history of the city, and therefore that is important. Now, this ghazal was written by Mirza Khan Dagh, as Saif has already mentioned him, famous for being quite a young Shagird Ghalib's. So, and he had connections with the Mughal royal court as well. But this poem was written in 1862. And the context is very interesting because it was published in a collection, an anthology of poetry. It was called Faghan-e-Delhi. And it was a collection of poems which talked, and it had a few poems which were from an earlier period, but the bulk of that book was made up of verses which were written by the poets of Delhi on the revolt of 1857, and specifically the aftermath of the revolt. So for those who may not be that familiar with Delhi's history of that period, just a very little bit on what this meant for Delhi. Delhi was already, the Mughal Empire had been in decline for a long, long time, from the 18th century, from the middle of the 18th century, power had, provinces had broken off, Mughal emperors had slowly become reduced to puppets after a while, and by 1803 the British conquered Delhi, and they became the actual rulers of Delhi, though they kept the Mughal emperor on as a sort of a puppet for a while, and after a while he was not even a puppet, he was just a pensioner living in the Red Fort. And of course, we all know what happened in 1857. There was this sudden mutiny of soldiers in Meerut. They came to Delhi. Next day, you know it, on the 11th of May 1857, the whole city was in upheaval because all the soldiers who were positioned here had joined the mutiny of the soldiers. A lot of the townspeople had joined them. Very soon, the Mughal royal family also threw in their lot with the rebel soldiers, and you had a revolt which slowly engulfed large parts of North India and almost all of North India, and it lasted for a very long time, over a year. Delhi was a very important center of the revolt. A lot of people, soldiers arrived here, and the revolt carried on for a good 4 months before the British recaptured the city. And when they recaptured the city, it was a bloodbath because a lot of people were killed, a lot of people just fled. They just fled, and those who did not leave were evacuated. They were thrown out of the city, and huge amounts of disruption. What happened in the aftermath? I think the best way of doing this is to, because the piece of poetry that I have picked, and the whole idea is to introduce the poetry, is that he talks about what the city is. A little bit of literary history here. The significance of this ghazal is immense. Why? Because it's in a genre, the Shahr Ashob, which was not normally written in the ghazal form. The Shahr Ashob or Shahr Ashob were mainly written as musaddas, which are with six sort of blocks of 6 lines, or the muhammas, which is 5. So the ghazal form, which is normally has very, very different themes in classical ghazal poetry, had not been used for these kind of poetry. So this is This is a very important moment in Urdu poetry itself, and we talk about the Anjuman movement in Lahore, which comes a little bit later and talks about how you have to reform Urdu poetry. For instance, Hali's Muqaddimah-e-Sher o Shairi, the introduction he writes, it talks about reform of Urdu poetry, but this is happening before that. So it has that, for those who are interested in Urdu literature, that is the moment there. But I'm talking about the poetry. So he starts, this is a lament that he is writing. And he says, यूं मिटा जैसे कि दहली से गुमान दहली था मेरा नाम और निशान दहली. So he talks about how it's his, his world has also been turned upside down. And the way he sees himself being wiped out from the city is the way Delhi ka naam aur nishan Delhi se mit gaya. The way Delhi's identity has been disrupted by this. And it's very interesting that all of these poets, when they write, you cannot make out whether they are talking about the disruption caused by the revolt or the disruption caused by the suppression of the revolt. Because there is ambiguity there also. ले गए लूट के अब शौकत और शान दहली पूर्वी पहले उड़ाते थे ज़बान दहली. So that's interesting, huh? So ले गए लूट के अब शौकत और शान दहली. कौन ले गए हैं लूट के शौकत और शान दहली? पूर्वी, जो पूरब से आए. पूरब से कौन आया है? The soldiers, the rebel soldiers, the बागी सिपाही जो है. नहीं, not East India Company. Those who have come from the east. This is the cultural chauvinism of a Delhi person coming. It's true. जो उड़ाते थे ज़ुबान Delhi, they are. I think early in the 19th century, this one, what's his name? The guy who wrote Darya-e-Latafat, Inshallah Khan. Inshallah Khan wrote this Darya-e-Latafat, and it's amazing because he exemplifies this kind of chauvinism कि सिर्फ दिल्ली वाले जो बोलते हैं language वो ही ठीक है, कोई और ठीक नहीं बोलता है. और he is okay even though he has not lived in Delhi because his parents were from Delhi. so that thing is there. So I'm talking about the ambiguity. When we're looking at 1857 as a historical event, this is, we look at it in very black and white terms as these were the patriots and those who are opposing them or are not supporting them, they are in some ways, they are the Ghaddar. But it's very complex. These are soldiers who've come from outside, who've taken over the city. And there is huge social disruption. There's huge social disruption. There is also a little bit of, the social order turning upside down. There are other examples of the poetry which talk about that disruption of the social order. The idea that, there are these new people who are upstarts who are taking over the city. And so therefore, it's not as if everybody was with the rebels. In fact, most of these poets who we see represented in this kind of poetry take a very conservative position. In fact, Dag is one of them, and the reason I picked Dag is because he is much more balanced. He knows that there is a problem because of the revolt, but he also is critical of the British. I'll come to that just now. And Delhi वालों के लिए ताज़ा बनेगी जन्नत, ले गए सर पे मलिक तोहफा मकान दिल्ली. And those who are familiar with the destruction of the city after the revolt of 1857 will realize this. He says that now the people of Delhi, a new paradise will be created for them because what they had is just gone. It's gone because their beautiful houses. Ghalib wrote in one of his letters that पूरे जो मोहल्ले थे, उर्दू बाजार, खानों का बाजार, खास बाजार, कहाँ थे पता नहीं है क्योंकि सब उजड़ रहा है, शहर टूट रहा है. And he's talking at precisely this moment. I think his letter dates from 1861-62 when he talks about how these things are being demolished. So that is what he's saying, that they have just been, all these houses have been taken away, they've just been broken down. Garam hangama hue lala rukhane Punjab, gul खिलाए हैं नए तूने खिजाने देवी. Lala Rukhane Punjab, ये कौन है जो इनका these tulip-faced ones from Punjab, they are now the ones who are creating the tumult. क्यों? Because Delhi was part of the northwestern provinces. It was part of that, but just it was a little bit of the history of the revolt. The way the British recaptured Delhi after the revolt was, they assembled this army, and mostly it was made up of troops from the Punjab. And they came and, the Delhi Field Force, as they called it, recaptured the city. So not only was the Punjab force which recaptured Delhi, but Delhi after that was put under martial law and was made a part of the province of Punjab. So it is the Punjab people who are now, they are the ones who are they are the fame of Delhi, and that's about it. And this is kya gul khilaye hain naye tune khizane, which means that in the waste of Delhi, in the the autumn of Delhi, there is this new flowers are coming up, which are from the Punjab. And then there is some part which is very typical of the Shahr Ashob, of the older style of Shahr Ashob, where they talk about how wonderful all the people were. And they, many of these kind of poems idealize an older age. That is part of the genre. Rash ke shamshad tha har khush qad wo har khush raftar, sarve azad tha ek ek jawane devi. So it's in praise of the people of Delhi, of the young men, for instance. Aare-e saaf tha ek ek musaffa bazaar, chashme pur jalwa ek ek dukaan Delhi. So the shops of Delhi are beautiful. Each bazaar is beautiful. All these were there, and you can relate all of this to the destruction of Delhi. For instance, it quite literally was that the Chandni Chowk Bazaar, which is around the chalk. Chalk was literally just the chalk in front of the town hall, right? Which later, where the town hall came, that was the Chandni Chowk. और वो चौक में चारों तरफ बाजार दुकानें बनी हुई थी, and that was literally destroyed. So there are a reference to that. इससे बढ़कर कोई महशर में ना होएगा हिसाब, बस यही होगा कि हम और बयान दें. So at the day of judgment, that will be, the only thing that will remain is me, and I will give an account of Delhi. That's all I can give over there. And then he is, as I said, one of the few poets who is openly critical of the British also. Because if you look at, you'll be surprised, and you look at this poetry, it is all quite actually, some of it is openly as a panegyric to the new British administration. And you can see the point. You can see the point not because one of the reasons I have pointed out, which is that these are people who have suffered during the revolt, and what they are suffering now, they are often putting it to the fact that the revolt took place in the first place. So that is there. But also, it is still a risk to actually speak openly. It is a risk to open your mouth and say something. And that is one reason why, in fact, for many years, there was a silence around 1857. Nobody spoke about it. It takes, I think it's the 1880s that the first memoirs of what life was like before 1857 start to come out. All your popular kind of memoirs comes out from the 1880s onwards. For a long time, for a quarter of a century, there's absolute silence. So the fact that they are actually saying even this much is huge. So he says, "Mustada waqt ke phir aaye yahan sahib log, zeb-e Dehli hai koi, है कोई शान दिल्ली. So he's saying कि साहब अब फिर वापस आ गए हैं and they are the ornament of Delhi. This is all said ironically by the way. दे दिए फौज को हुक्काम ने इनाम में सब गंजे कानून से फजून गंजे निहाने दिल्ली. Which means all the, you know, and this was the you know, people used to hide treasures in their houses. किसी ने ज़मीन में दबा दिया, किसी ने दीवारों के अंदर चुनवा दिया. Their valuables used to be put away like this. And these, the prize agents that were appointed by the army to go and look for these treasures. And there were people who used to point out, you know, often the people who were the bricklayers who used to actually help them to bury these things, they came forward and became informants of the new administration, of the prize agents, and they dug these up. So that is a reference to that.
Sorry, might I quickly add, Swapna has produced a wonderful translation of this ghazal, which is in the handout that many of you have. So as she's reading, those of you who don't know the original Urdu, can read from the handout and follow it in English as well. Sorry.
So this is basically that the army has been given these as a prize, and these you know, hidden treasures of Delhi are now. Then he says, किले में बारके लोहे की बनी है क्या खूब, नहीं कलकत्ता अब बरस तो बसाने दे. The barracks in the fort. You know, even today when you go, you will see these tall Victorian barracks that came up after 1857. He says, what wonderful barracks in the fort. Now Calcutta is not a patch on Delhi. You know, so we have even better buildings in Delhi now than we have in Calcutta. And then he says, किले के नीचे का मैदान फिर उसमें वो सड़क के बदल कहिए जिसे है दिलो जाने दे. So he says about how change has come about. There is all the buildings. Today what we see as more or less that Maidan is still there. Between the Red Fort and the Jama Masjid, that whole open area was by 1857 was quite built up. So there was quite a lot of construction there. All these bazaars, which I said, Ghalib also mentioned that they had been broken, these were all there and those were cleared away. They were completely demolished. So that's what he said, okay, now look at this sadak in the middle of this Maidan. And then he goes on to say, gar ye Maidan na hota to ठिकाना ही ना था, तंग ही रहती सदा रूह और रवानी है. So अगर ये मैदान नहीं होता, इसमें इतनी खुली जगह नहीं होती, तो रूह और रवान, the heart and the soul would have been constrained, तंग रहता. So it's basically it's a tons satire on this thing. रौकश सद्दे सिकंदर इसे कहिए तो बजा, फतेहगढ़ है जो पहाड़ी पे किराने दे. So he says that ये जो and those who know their heritage of Delhi well would know ये फतेहगढ़ जो पहाड़ी है, it's the Mutiny Memorial. The Mutiny Memorial, which was built after 1857, he says this is Sadde Sikandar. It's the fort or the wall which is supposed to keep out. You know, there is this in medieval European as well as other traditions. There is this idea of a wall that was constructed to keep out invasions from the north. So that is, he calls it that. You know, the British have built this great wall, this great fort to keep themselves safe and keep people out. या खुदा मस्जिद जामी का रहे नाम बुलंद, अहले काबा कहीं वो आई आज़ाने दे. So this is a fairly conventional praise of the masjid, Jami Masjid. You must realize that at the time Dag was writing this, Jami Masjid was still not returned to worship. People, the army had confiscated it, had stationed troops there in the Sahel, and it was not returned till I think a few years after this is written. So it was confiscated. So what he is saying that uska naam rahe buland and azan Kabe tak sunai de. It is completely, you know, it's ironic because it's not happening, right? Nobody, not the people of Delhi cannot hear that azan now. And then, of course, he ends in a way that will be familiar to a lot of people. Nayyar o Ghalib o Azurda se phir log kahan, Dag ab ye hain ganimat hamadan de. So the idea that Nayyar, Ziauddin Ahmad Khan, Ghalib, of course, Ghalib, Azurda, Mufti Sadruddin Azurda, these kind of people were, बस अब यही लोग, ऐसे लोग फिर नहीं होंगे. This is that whole the lament of the age. अगर 1857 की कोई भी पोएट्री पढ़िए और बल्कि हाल ही का जो तज़किरा दिल्ली है महरूम भी अगर पढ़िए, तो the idea that this was a Delhi which is now gone and will not come back again. I would have said more about that, but वो किसी और वक्त बताऊंगी, क्योंकि मुझे जहाँ तक मेरा, as a historian, what I look at when I look at these things and I look at कौन से दौर में ऐसे पोइट्री कही गई है, and I always feel that हर एज में लोगों को लगता है कि बस अब ऐसे लोग अपने आने वाले हैं और हर अगले दौर में फिर ऐसे लोग होते हैं जिनको लोग when they pass then people feel that was they what was this age that has gone. And 1857 also was a moment like that कि it involved a lot of personal loss. Lot of people lost their homes, lost their livelihoods, lost dear family members, etc. All those coordinates of everyday life were lost. And in many ways, those personal losses got translated in their minds into cultural losses. So, what was a kind of personal, traumatic episode in the lives of people, which was 1857, it became translated in their own minds like a whole cultural change that had taken place. कि 1857 से पहले एक कल्चर था और 1857 के बाद एक कल्चर है, और मेरे ख्याल से 1947 में भी वही हुआ. I'm not talking about 1947 just now, but उसमें भी शायद वही हुआ कि the idea that culture बदल गया, अब वो दिल्ली नहीं रही. But my brief today, remit self-imposed, was to look at 1857. So I hope I've managed to convey some of the history through one. Thank you.